This is an article from the Reformed Presbyterian entitled Slavery in the United States, a National Sin. Having in preceding articles proved that holding men in slavery is sinful, we proceed to show that this sin is chargeable upon the whole people of the United States. That it is strictly a national sin appears, number one, because in the formation of the Union, slave-holding states were admitted. A very erroneous opinion prevails on this subject, namely, that the sin of slavery is confined to the states which suffered its existence and gave it a legal being by their legislative acts. This vindication of the American nation from the charge of slavery overlooks the important moral principle that one party may become partaker with another in sin as truly and properly as if he had been the primary transgressor. This may be done either before or subsequently to the perpetration of the crime. It may be done by giving countenance to evildoers in their sins, by abetting or aiding them in these, or by entering into associations with them, which imply the recognition and acknowledgement of anything morally wrong. Thus the United States becomes chargeable with the sin of slavery. They formed a national union, the grand principle of which was the residuary sovereignty of the several states. Quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Unquote. Slavery obtained an existence by the legislative power of states respectively, and the recognition of their residuary sovereignty was a virtual recognition of the legality of slavery, as this legislative power is recognized and conceded to each of them by agreement of the whole states in the Union. We do not say that the Federal Union gave to the several states the residuary sovereignty which they possess, but that the Union admits it and recognizes this lawfulness. While the authority thus nationally acknowledged, gave and continues to give to slavery its legal existence. Slavery, as a national evil, began here and is therefore chargeable upon the nation as well as upon the states more immediately concerned. The latter are guilty of slaveholding. The former are percipitus criminis, partakers in guilt, inasmuch as they have recognized the lawfulness of the authority by which slavery had its origin. Before the formation of the Union, slavery was the sin of the states individually. By the Union, the several states have become one nation, and the sin of the several states has thus become the sin of all the states collectively. The sin of the parts respectively becomes the sin of the whole nation. It has been sometimes said that the Union did not create the system of slavery, that it was in existence before the Union was formed. But this does not meet the charge brought against the United States that the Union gave a national sanction to the system. It is a national sin inasmuch as slavery is recognized by the United States in the admission of states to the Union, having slavery as a part and parcel of their residuary sovereignty. The principle of morals on which we proceed is that one party in a contract cannot, without committing sin, concede to another party in the contract the power of doing wrong. The association of numbers cannot alter the nature of a sinful act, course of acting. Civil society in its natural form is as much bound by the authority of the law of God as an individual, the divine law being obligatory upon men in every possible relation. If it is wrong for an individual to hold slaves, it is wrong for a state to permit him to do it, and to secure to him the right by authority of law. But if it is wrong for a state, it is equally wrong for a number of states to recognize it in their national confederacy. The action of Congress, subsequent to the adoption of the United States Constitution, proves, irrespective of the right conceded to the slaveholding states at the period of the Confederation, the national guilt. We refer to the law which points out the manner in which fugitive slaves are to be claimed and prohibits by a severe penalty anyone from interfering. Quote, "Any person who shall knowingly and willingly obstruct or hinder such claimant, his agent or attorney, in so seizing or arresting such fugitive from labor, or shall rescue such fugitive from such claimant, his agent or attorney, when so arrested, pursuant to the authority herein given, or shall harbor or conceal such person, after notice that he or she was a fugitive from labor, as aforesaid, shall for either of the said offenses forfeit and pay the sum of $500. Unquote. This act of Congress not only proves that the right to hold slaves was conceded to the slaveholding states, but that it was guaranteed to them. The formation of the Union was voluntary. No state was bound to enter into it. But if a union was to be formed, it was clearly the duty of the parties forming it to form it on correct moral principles. They had no right to plead exemption from the obligations of morality and truth. Nor let it be pled as an apology that the Southern states would not have entered into the Union. if the abolition of slavery had been made a condition. Admit that they would not. This by no means justifies the formation of the Union, yielding as it does to the states, the right of holding slaves. If the slave-holding states would not consent to the Union unless their right to commit sin was admitted, then let them remain out. Better far that the Confederation had never been formed than to have been formed by the admission of a system which violates the principles of equity, and fixes a stain on the national escutcheon which nothing but a speedy national repentance can efface. Infinitely better had it been to endure every supposable inconvenience than to avoid it by doing wrong. It is better to suffer than to sin. But we do not admit that a faithful adherence to right principle would have led to the slightest inconvenience. Had there been sufficient virtue to have taken a decided stand on the great principles of equity and humanity, had there been a regard to the interests and welfare of the whole population, irrespective of caste and color, had the professed patriotism and attachment to liberty been sincere, had not selfishness triumphed over pure and liberal principle, then the abolition of slavery would have been made a sine qua non of the Federal Union, and the evil of slavery must have ceased throughout the Confederacy. The reasons why it did not cease were the absence of moral principle, the predominance of selfishness, and a disregard to the authority of God as revealed in the Scriptures. The parties did not feel the obligation of the divine law as reaching them in their national character, and mere expediency was substituted in the room of justice. Slavery was conceded to the Southern states, that their hearty cooperation might be secured to strengthen the Union. But it needs not the gift of prophecy to see that the continuance of slavery, and that ere long, may prove most injurious to the national prosperity, that it may lead to the dissolution of the Union itself, if it be not prevented by speedy repentance, so that the dreaded result, for avoiding of which the principle of equity was compromitted, will we fear be experienced in a more alarming manner. Number 2. By the admission of slaveholding states into the Union since its formation, the United States have made slavery a national sin. They have conceded to these states a legal right to hold slaves, and have put it beyond their own constitutional power to correct the evil. For these sinful national acts, not even the unsatisfactory excuse pled in behalf of constituting the Union can be offered. States coming into the Union, subsequently to its formation, must come in on the terms prescribed by Congress. While they were territories, Congress had the power of abolishing slavery in them, as they prohibited it in the territory northwest of the Ohio River. Quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same, from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as aforesaid." Unquote. The exercise of similar legislative jurisdiction would have annihilated slavery in Missouri and Arkansas. The sin of suffering it to exist in those territories was the sin of the United States, and the sin of admitting them into the Union with the recognized right of holding slaves was, and still is, the sin of the United States. By admitting them, they have demonstrated to the world that they do not hate slavery, but, on the contrary, cherish and support it by the exercise of national power. Slavery is, therefore, a national sin. If the people of the United States choose to persist in their sinful course of expediency and set justice at defiance, if they choose to truckle to the impotent and arrogant bravado of slaveholders, and be intimidated from the practice of national righteousness by the threadbare threats of dissolving the Union, then let them look to it. The guilt of slavery is on the nation. They must bear the reproach and take the consequence of supporting it. Number 3. Slavery is retained in the District of Columbia. This alone would be sufficient to substantiate the charge of slavery against the United States. In this case, the sin cannot be rolled over upon state sovereignty, nor the peculiar nature of the Confederacy plead as an argument why the general government should not interfere. To Congress belongs the power of legislating for the District of Columbia in all matters which in the several states are reserved to state legislatures. Quote, "Congress shall have power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states, and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, unquote. There is no restriction of the power of Congress on the subject of slavery in the District of Columbia. If it is not abolished here, it is not for want of power, but for want of will. The reason is because Congress pays greater respect to the prejudices and dictation of the South than to humanity and justice. The District of Columbia is the greatest slave market within the United States. And to complete the national infamy, the trade in human beings, the dealing in souls and bodies of men is licensed and made the means of aiding in the revenue. For $400 a year, the heartless and unprincipled man dealer, may carry on his nefarious traffic. Number 4, the Constitution of the United States gives Congress full power to regulate internal commerce, and as slaves are admitted in law to be the property of their owners, as they are bought and sold like mere property, the regulation of the internal slave traffic comes within their power. Quote, the Congress shall have no power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes, unquote. That from the Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 8. This provision of the federal Constitution settles the question of power and places the internal slave traffic indisputably within the operation of the power of Congress. It belongs to them to determine how the trade shall be carried on, whether it shall be carried on in any way, The internal traffic in slaves is immense, and scarcely less horrid in its details than that of foreign trade. The raising of slaves for the new and more southern states forms a large part of the business, and creates a great portion of the wealth in Virginia and other slave states. The seat of the national government is the great mart where licensed dealers daily buy and sell God's own image. There, while some chivalrous southerner may be heard declaiming the Congress on the blessings of liberty, the auctioneer is selling it to the highest bidder, and that, too, within sight and hearing of the Capitol. With the acclamations and shouts of the 4th of July rejoicings may be heard mingled the soul-piercing irony of the slave who, while marched off to the South at the crack of the whip, uplifts his manacled hands and sings, Hail Columbia, happy land. By an act of Congress, the foreign slave trade was suppressed, and a violation of this law declared piracy. If the foreign trade is piracy, the domestic or internal trade must be criminal, Congress being the judges. There can be no difference of criminality from the mere circumstance that the deed has been committed on the high seas or within the United States. Make the foreign trade piracy, and leave the internal trade under the protection of law? That cannot be morally right when done within the jurisdiction of the United States, which is immoral on the coast of Africa or on the high seas. Morality does not change with the change of place. The distinction between right and wrong has its origin in the perfections of the divine character, and, like God himself, is immutable. That which is sinful is so everywhere, and under every circumstance. Congress, by suppressing the foreign trade on the ground of criminality, proves its own guilt and the guilt of the nation in permitting the internal trade. The United States are thus shut up in a dilemma from which they cannot escape, otherwise than by prohibiting the internal as they have done the foreign trade. Were Congress to exercise the power with which the Constitution has invested them by suppressing the internal traffic in slaves, it would do much to remedy the evil of slavery, not only by lessening the aggregate of the evil, but by branding domestic slavery with the indelible mark of national displeasure. It would, we doubt not, ultimately tend to the abolition of slavery, in some, at least, of the states. First, by discountenancing and making it odious. Secondly, by making it unprofitable. These two effects, which would follow the suppression of the domestic traffic, would unavoidably have the tendency to put down slavery itself in such states as furnish slaves for the home market.